you make a good point about how it's a revolution that doesn't want to be named. I have a theory about this, which is that, there's this famous line. It actually doesn't come from the people who usually attribute it to him. But there's this concept of the long march through the institutions, how the left took over all of the commanding heights of the culture. And it actually comes from the 1970s, but it's attributed to this guy who I'm spacing, a sort of Frankfurt School Marxist guy. And I think that sort of gets at part of the problem is they want to have their cake and eat it too, insofar as they want revolutionary ends, but they want to hide behind establishment credibility.
Yes.
And so there are a lot of revolutionary sort of unconstrained vision types running a lot of these elite institutions, but whenever they get into trouble, they fall back on the prestige of the institution to defend what they're doing as just sort of best practices rather than actually anything else. And so,
and scientific language and
right. So why don't we start sort of there?
It's very interesting. I mean, it is a movement that doesn't like being named, that doesn't want to be called out. And in part, like you say, it's useful because you can do big changes and say, we're not doing any changes. And it's like, let's say with preferential hiring practices and DEI, if you say the movement wants preferential hiring practices, but if you say there are preferential hiring practices happening, you're not supposed to like say the thing it's very strange. You're supposed to play the game of fighting for a thing, getting the change, but then saying there's been no change. You're not allowed to notice the change and talk about the change, which is really weird and quite confusing.
So like one of the chapters you have on here, this is a very much a remnant bingo card topic, is abolish the police or defund the police.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that this tracks perfectly this phenomenon where there's really no more sort of radical idea than to basically, in effect, abolish the police function of the state. It's like what the state is actually for, going back to Max Weber or I don't know, Hammurabi, is to police crime. Now, what counts as a crime sometimes in past societies shouldn't have been counted as a crime, but like everyone agrees, like I don't know, rape, murder, these things are
basics
crimes, and that you need someone in charge of making sure that they don't happen or the people who do them are punished for it. So why don't you sort of talk through the chapter about abolish the police a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting because it shows in part how the movement that now is the progressive movement and the American left, it's a very unusual kind of leftism, a very unusual kind of progressivism, because let's say abolish the police. Perfect example. You have a movement that wants people called violence interrupters and community helpers instead of cops. And of course, this comes from the murder of George Floyd, and it comes from this like righteous rage that a lot of us felt. And the answer was, we need to get rid of the policing system altogether. We need to get rid of the cops altogether. And we need to do this new utopian vision. But what that looks like is a bunch of guys from the community being hired. And usually these are good guys in the community, in the neighborhood, who genuinely want less violence, less gun violence. And for the violence interrupter program, let's say, looks like a bunch of guys being hired to wander around the neighborhood and get in the way of violence, to quote unquote interrupt violence. And they go out without body armor. They go out without guns, of course. And they go out without pensions, without unions. And they of course report being more victims of violence, of gunshot wounds, they report astronomical levels of violence that they themselves suffer from without any of the protections of the things that the boring old liberals used to argue for. Like the boring old liberal response to a George Floyd event would be, we need better trained cops. We need better they need more funding. Like the unions and the pensions, these are good things for people who are putting themselves in harm's way. And that we need to do more funding to make the cops better. I'm not the first to make that argument. But in the chapter on defund, I write about the one particular violence interrupter and his work and the program in general, and sort of the strangeness of an American movement that wants to, like you said, basically privatize or just really destabilize the basic function of the state, which is to protect citizens. And then I also write about the weirdness of how fast the American media class went along with this. I mean, it was just a foundational belief. If you didn't, I remember when I was still kind of trying to like get along with the movement at the times and trying to like play good and fit in. I remember being like, well, like in a conversation with colleagues, like, well, no, it's not that I'm not for defunding the police. I just don't think we should abolish. I just don't think we should abolish, guys. And that was considered like the wild centrist take within a bunch of New York Times reporters. Yeah. And I look back on that. Obviously, I'm embarrassed of myself for like arguing for something I didn't even agree with, but that I thought was sort of the more moderate, like save my skin position. And also just like, how did the rhetoric get to the point where a group of New York Times reporters baseline was the police should be abolished? And I think that now we're in this funny moment where a lot of the excesses of the movement we're all pretending didn't happen. And now you would be hard pressed to find a reporter who would be willing to say that abolish the police was something that anyone was for. But it happened. It was a movement and it had some wins. And
I mean, one of my favorite moments was when even people like Jim Clyburn were like, guys, slow your roll. We can't actually win campaigns calling for getting rid of police. And like, I was very into this stuff at the time. And I looked at all the polls. There was not a single poll anywhere in America that said, get rid of the police. There were polls, like a majority of African Americans said they wanted, like the same amount of police or something like that. And and a significant number said fewer police, but there's a huge difference between fewer and zero, right? I mean, like, and it was starting to dawn on sort of the MSNBC producer, New York Times op-ed crowd that like, oh crap, we allowed ourselves to get talked into this thing that is going to get us killed at the polls. And so you had these moments, and I can't remember the names of them, but I wrote them down at the time and wrote about them, where you would have these anchors on like MSNBC get, the professor of dog barking is allowed on this podcast. Don't worry about it. You get like, the professor of sociology from UC Fresno on, who's written countless non-peer reviewed pieces, articles on the carceral state and the prison industrial complex. And they'd be talking about, defund the police. And the anchors would be like, well, when you say defund, what you really mean, we should just be clear to the listeners. We mean, reallocate resources to violence interrupters and more mental health services, but we still want some police. And they were like, no, we're quite serious. We want no police. And at one point, the Times actually ran an op-ed saying, I think literally the headline of the op-ed was, yes, we mean abolish the police. And it was
exactly.
Like the refusal of the radicals to go along, So just explain to me, like, my theory about this has always been like that there is the blood-brain barrier between sort of elite campuses and sort of radical expert types, credentializers of these ideas, and the sort of 26-year-old booker or producer from, who got a degree from Brown. They don't know that because, again, they don't realize that the people that they think are the experts are actually revolutionaries. They think, oh, well, this esteemed, he has a PhD, he's tenured, he must be right. And so they lose this ability, in the way that fish don't know they're wet, of understanding that, like, being an uncritical transmission belt from these corners of academia is actually bad for progressivism and bad for liberalism. How accurate is that?
I think that assumes that people are naive in a way that I don't think that people were entirely naive at what was happening in 2020 and 2021 with the rhetoric and into 2022. And now I would say 23 is when it slowed down. I don't think people were naive about what they were doing. I think there was a concerted effort to do a revolution. And you had the COVID lockdowns, which were really helpful to the movement, and which I think after the vaccines came out and you saw the movement still argue, we still need to be locked down. We still need, you had kind of a moment of radical change in everyday Americans' lives. And the movement wanted to take advantage of that. I don't think that the bookers were naive about what they were doing. I think it was like, let's go for it. Let's do this. And the tools they had were new tools. So you could sort of point to a tech factor where you could say that internal slacks within newsrooms and institutions became ways to flatten the hierarchy, to give that booker power they didn't used to have. At least within the Times, that was how it worked. Like all of a sudden, a few young staffers who hadn't proved themselves as great reporters could be yelling at the editor-in-chief in the all-company 4,000-person Slack room. And the editor-in-chief felt obligated to respond and to answer them and to basically get on their level and say, you know, you make some good points, but I would disagree here. And so you had the tools that flattened hierarchies, and you had Twitter. So you could have a few, let's say at MSNBC or at CNN, there was always the risk that a couple of these folks, these young folks, could go rogue and start tweeting about you. And if you're an executive of one of these companies, you're a little scared of that because you've seen other people get fired when 5 people started tweeting mean things about them. So no, I think it was very clever. I think lockdowns were a really big part of it, and that with all of us fractured and a lot of our community services shut down, a lot of our communal spaces shut down, again, even after we had the vaccine, that there was a concerted effort to do a revolution and to a revolution of abolishing the police, a revolution around gender, a revolution. I mean, to get some of these things through, at least. And I have a chapter about San Francisco. In San Francisco, there was a reason why the school board waited for lockdowns to say, we're finally getting rid of our elite public high school. What did that have to do with lockdowns?
Right.
Nothing.
Right.
But that was the moment when they were like, you know what, everyone's kind of feeling fractured and distracted and out of sorts. We're going to get rid of our version of Stuyvesant now. This is our moment. They decided we're going to rename all the schools in San Francisco, or half the schools in San Francisco, to get rid of famous racist names such as Abraham Lincoln, Dianne Feinstein. And a lot of this stuff is really funny, and I try to like make it funny when I'm writing about it, but it's also just like kind of impressive for if you think about how quickly it all moved. And and for a few years they did get rid of the elite public high school in San Francisco, and these longtime goals of this movement they succeeded in. So I don't think it was naive.